Hello, and welcome to this mental health spotlight topic produced by Warwickshire Educational Psychology Service, focusing upon autistic girls and mental health. My name is Dr. Heather Carver, and I'm a specialist senior educational psychologist. So this spotlight is the follow-up from the session that was delivered on the 27th of June 2024, and I must say a huge thank you to Eve Godwin from the Specialist Teachers Service, who helped in the development of this training and the delivery of it on the 27th of June too. So this spotlight topic specifically focuses on autistic girls' mental health and what we can do in schools to support them. So what I'll be covering today is somewhat of an introduction, as there's so much more to learn and understand about autistic girls and their mental health than I can possibly cover in this session today. But hopefully, this will be a good starting point for yourselves. And at the end, I'll be talking through some recommended resources and some signposts that you can explore to get more of an understanding about this hugely important topic. But today, I'll take you through these main sections, really. So firstly, we'll have a quick rethink about female autism and understanding what we mean by that and the sort of the language that we use around that. I'll then share with you what's understood about autistic females' experiences and how this is understood to impact their mental health. I'll also take you through, of course, some of the positives and the protective factors that are understood before talking through how we can then best support autistic females in our schools and in our settings across Warwickshire to be the most beneficial for their mental health. And then I'll also leave you with some further signposting for yourselves, for parents, and for working with young people in your settings too. As we go through the session today, it'll be really helpful to hold in mind a child or a young person that you're currently supporting, to reflect upon what rings true for them, or what more you can understand about their experiences following the discussions that I'll take you through. I also at this point want to briefly introduce you to my research that I've conducted, as I'll refer to parts of this throughout, and I'll be drawing from that research some quotes from the young people that I worked with. So just to help you understand a bit more about what I'm going on about when I'm talking about that. So it was as part of my doctorate degree to become an educational psychologist. I wanted to explore the experiences of adolescent autistic girls and their understanding of their diagnosis in terms of their identity and how they make sense of that. So to do that, I had the absolute pleasure of meeting 5 autistic girls and speaking with them to sort of gain their story or their narrative, which I then went on to analyse and learn from too. I won't bore you with all the details of the whole research project, but just to point out that throughout the session I will be sharing some of the quotes from the girls, which are really insightful, and also some of the Dixit cards that they chose during our conversations. So Dixit cards are sort of abstract artwork. They're actually from a board game, but it really helped to demonstrate, I think, some of their thoughts quite visually. So they can be helpful to look at too. Although today's session is called Autistic Girls and discussing autistic females, it's important to deconstruct that language for a second, as it isn't quite as simple as it seems at first. So although there is now the understanding that autism can present differently in females to the traditional male presentation, using the sex or the gender to identify that difference isn't always helpful, as that the female presentation doesn't always relate to all females, or it doesn't even only relate to females. So what's more important to hold on to is to be needs-led rather than gender or sex-led. So it's perhaps better understood as the internalized presentation. However, research that I'll refer to as we go through today's session usually distinguishes by sex. So female or girls will be referred to today. But I just want you to keep this in mind throughout and when talking or writing about autism, sort of following this session, and as a message to take away. Another note on language that I just want to say at this point is that research, particularly within the autistic community, tells us that autistic individuals prefer to be called exactly that, autistic individuals, not someone with autism. So this is known as using identity first language. There are obviously individual preferences, and different people will prefer different things. So it is important to check it out with them first. But if there's a sort of a default, we do use identity first language. So I think it's quite widely understood, or quite widely talked about now at least, how females are particularly under-identified as autistic compared to autistic males. So it's important to spend a bit of time, I guess, understanding why that might be the case and why they fly under the radar, as it's sometimes said. So basically, there's a few different reasons for this, and it's probably an amalgamation of all of these reasons together. But initially, it's important to understand that there is a male bias in the research and in the information available and in the media surrounding autistic individuals. So females, therefore, are less likely to be diagnosed based upon that traditional understanding of autism and the sort of the classic male presentation. So it's been commonly quoted, for example, that 1 female to every 4 males are diagnosed as autistic. But that this is sort of decreasing, that gap is decreasing, and more recent quotes are more like 1 to 2. So that gender gap is closing, which is important to acknowledge. But some of the issues with autism being recognised in females start with that diagnostic criteria, because that diagnostic criteria was based upon the traditional male presentation. So differences, for example, are for those with an internalized autism presentation, or that more female presentation, tend to show less or fewer restricted interests and repetitive behaviours. And the restricted interests that are shown might be more in line with typical interests, such as liking animals or certain bands or celebrities, and they might just know everything about that specific topic. But because they're sort of more in line with the norm, it's not quite as noticed. Also, due to the stereotypical social world of females, particularly in primary schools, girls can sort of compensate and fit in more to the external observer, at least. With girls' play traditionally, there is more sort of chatting and language-based play. And we know that girls tend to have better language skills than boys at many ages. It might be playing clapping games sort of just in pairs rather than a big competitive team game like in football. Please remember I'm drawing big stereotypes here, but it is also based on the research of what we know of those gender differences. But I know, and it's important to acknowledge it, it's not always the case, okay? But also within that social world, non-autistic girls are more likely to compensate for a peer and to be more inclusive of a peer who, they're less likely to sort of push them out of their small friendship group. So all of this can mean that to a sort of adult external observer, an autistic girl doesn't stand out quite as much as an autistic boy might. However, when they reach secondary school, this can change quite dramatically due to the additional complexity of the social world and becoming teenagers, and that increased demand of the school environment and curriculum, which means that those coping strategies that they had developed in primary school no longer work. So this is when autistic girls can begin to noticeably struggle, and when the adults around them perhaps pick up on some of those difficulties. And I guess I wonder if that's the case for many of those children that you might be holding in mind today. So the concept of masking or camouflaging is also important to acknowledge, which is the idea that an autistic individual sort of modifies their behaviour or their language to fit in and become less noticeably different. But this can take conscious effort to do something that non-autistic individuals do more subconsciously. Although everyone does mask to some extent, autistic or non-autistic, it's the level of effort and the negative impact that this can have on an individual that is then important to recognise, and that's when it becomes a real problem for these young people. But I'll talk more about masking in a couple of slides too. Another important thing to consider when we're thinking about autistic females is what are their specific experiences and how does that differ in some ways, at least, to autistic males. So due to the sort of male bias, as I mentioned before, that has pervaded the autism world and the discussions around autism for so long, it has only been recognised in the sort of past decade or two, really, that there wasn't that understanding of what autism is like for females and what their experiences are. So thankfully, there has been more of a shift and more research is being done to understand this, which is great. So here are some of, minimal, but some of the key themes that I'll talk you through. Okay, so friendships, first of all. So there might be some differences in how autistic girls experience their friendships, or that they might sort of struggle to make those genuine friendships. However, what is important to understand is that typically they still want friends and they still benefit from them. They get all of those pro-social benefits and mental health benefits too. So a couple of quotes from the girls that I met for my research when they were discussing their friendships are, one of them said to me, "Everyone else just seemed to pick up on what to do, especially like friendship groups. Everyone knew how to make a friend in the right way." So for that young person, they just felt confused and they didn't feel like they knew how to make those friends. And the second young person's quote was, "I always thought that I didn't really fit in as much. I was always just a bit confused how everyone would always know what to do. I just never really got it." So you can see that confusion around actually, other people seem to pick this up quite easily, but it was more effortful for them. The second experience I'm going to just touch lightly on is around school. So we know that from the research, autistic children, so male and female, are generally at a higher risk of underachieving. But this is not necessarily due to academic ability or learning needs specifically. Instead, it's understood to be due to other aspects of school, so such as the sensory environment being overwhelming or overstimulating, or the sort of organisation and planning skills needed to get themselves around the school if it's secondary school, or just organise themselves for their lessons in primary school. These are sort of executive functioning difficulties. But also the social world of school can be very overwhelming as well. So again, a couple of quotes from the girls in my research are, "My classroom was quite big. It's quite a crowded classroom and really loud, and the lights were bright. Then the sounds, they just really hurt your ears." So that's that sensory environment being too much for that young person. Then the second one was just a reflection on the learning. And she said, just the work they were doing, it was too much. She just felt overwhelmed by those demands and the curriculum. And then the third experience I'm going to just touch on is that social vulnerability. So it's understood that autistic individuals are, some research suggests, 4 times more likely than non-autistic individuals to be bullied, which is a really high statistic. One of the girls I spoke to in my research, particularly reflected upon her emotional trauma, as she termed it, as a result of the bullying that she'd experienced. And she described it as being punished and shamed so much for being who I am. Again, her words. There's also needs to be acknowledged is the increased vulnerability to sexual exploitation for autistic girls, well, autistic individuals generally, but it is again increased for autistic females. 2 studies that have explored this, and I've got statistics from, shared that 50% in one of the studies or 65% in the other study, so they spoke to adult autistic female participants, they describe being taken advantage of sexually or experiencing sexual abuse. So these are unfortunately can be common experiences for autistic females. And it's important for us as adults working with these young people to understand that these are, I guess, potential risks or might be potential experiences for these people. And we know, again, from the research that negative experiences in these senses, so negative friendships or not making those friendship groups, negative experiences at school and feeling pushed out or overwhelmed, and negativity around that social vulnerability and bullying, for example, are some of the contributing factors to poor mental health in autistic females. So again, it's just important for us as adults working with them to be aware and hold that in mind. I'm going to move on to thinking a little bit about the masking or camouflaging, as it's sometimes called. So this is one of the concepts that is beginning to be more and more discussed in regards to female autism, or the internalized presentation of autism. So this is the idea that a lot of autistic females use strategies to sort of hide their autism, such as copying body language or accents. They might actively research, how to act in certain situations, or even create a different persona for themselves when they are in those social situations. And this can happen consciously or subconsciously for them as well. But there might be many reasons of the why someone might want to mask or camouflage, as those described on the slide. It might be in order to fit in. It might be that they don't know that they don't need to do it. That they don't realize that other people don't need to do it to the extent they do. They might want to develop friendships and feel that sense of belonging, and they feel this is the only way to do it, which, those developing friendships and sense of belonging is just a natural human need. So they're just trying to fulfill those basic human needs. But although masking or camouflaging can help them sort of fit in the short term and on that surface level, research is also showing there can be some negative effects of it, so such as not receiving the help or the support that they need, because it's not noticeable that they need that help or support. There's also the extreme exhaustion that can come alongside it, or burnout even, that it can cause. It's quite common to hear of learners who can manage absolutely fine, supposedly, in school, but then when they get home, they become overwhelmed and they have that sort of emotional meltdown or behavioural meltdown even. And it can also lead to sort of identity confusion, even if they are very good at masking. It can also lead to that miss or missed diagnosis. So again, it's understood that it's quite common for autistic females to have been given diagnoses of mental health conditions before receiving their autism diagnosis, which may have been unidentified autism at the time, or maybe a mental health condition because of their unidentified autism, or it may be a mental health condition they would have alongside autism anyway. So masking or camouflaging was a theme spoken about by all but one of the participants in my research. So I've got some of their quotes here to share with you, alongside some of the Dixit cards, some of those artwork that they chose to describe it further. So one young person said, it wasn't just that I was shy. I was really, really scared, but I would just put on a happy front. I wouldn't say that anything's wrong. Another person who chose this card alongside it with the masks on said, this picture is about how you do what you think people should, how you should behave in a situation. So you've got to put on a mask almost. Another child chose this picture, and she described it as, all of it is in different parts, and at home I'm a very different person to when I'm outside or when I'm with the people that I know and trust. So sort of talking about how she's different in those different environments, but she's so conscious of that. And then finally, someone else said, I'd obviously had a very difficult time with school, but I'd not been showing it outwardly. So it had all been building up until like very early on in year 8, and I just had a massive panic attack before we got to school, and from then on I had big trouble getting into school. So you can see how that internalizing, that masking led to those panic attacks for that young person and mental health difficulties, and then that difficulty in attending school too. So you can see the consequences and the potential impact that this can have. But just to spend a bit more time focusing on mental health generally for autistic girls. So there's lots of research into this that sort of suggests how autistic girls have a higher chance of internalizing their challenges, which can lead to these mental health difficulties. But that is not to discredit, of course, the externalized difficulties that can also present, just remembering that distinction that we talked about at the start. So depression, there's a higher chance of depression. Eating disorders, an increased chance. Anxiety, also a heightened chance. And a quote that I've drawn from my research again to share with you illustrates that. So someone said, I had so many panic attacks at primary school, I just didn't know what they were at the time. I just knew that I didn't like the feeling, and that's why I stopped going to school. There's a higher risk of gender dysphoria. There's a higher risk of self-harm. So another quote from one of the girls that I worked with said, I'd fluctuate in anger and trust issues. And she described she'd have explosions where I'd do self-destructive behaviours and then scream and fight and just be generally not very fun. There's often lower self-esteem, increased risk of adult suicide, mental health co-occurring conditions, so additionally to depression or anxiety. EBSA, so the emotionally based school avoidance, which we've already heard a couple of quotes from girls in my research that sort of discuss that. Challenges around their identity formation and understanding themselves. So again, a quote from a girl that I spoke with said, having autism whilst I was trying to grow up, just being a normal teenager, definitely made it harder, and the process was slower than it was with my friends. So she could notice that difference and comparison sort of with her friends. And finally, that autistic burnout, which is something that's beginning to be more talked about and understood more too. So we know that autistic females in general are at higher risk of these mental health difficulties. But we will go on to having a think about what we can do to help protect their mental health and how we can support those who are already experiencing some of these difficulties. So, as ever, it is so important to think about the strengths and the positive and protective factors as well, because this is so important too. Although I've already covered, the risk factors, the difficulties that young people can have with their mental health, there are these protective factors around the autistic female experiences that are also really positive to discuss. So things or positives that females have directly related to their autism in the research, when they've, not just my own, but when they've discussed things, include things such as enjoying their sensory experiences, enjoying discussing their special interests with others and researching into that in the depth they do, having a unique perspective and being out of the box thinkers, having strong observation skills, a long attention span, a good memory, increased empathy, and that creativity and advanced intelligence even. And there are quotes from the girls in my research that highlighted the positives that they also attributed to their autism too. And these are on the slides. I won't read through them individually for you, but feel free to pause if you want to have a look at them. But what's important to note here is that in regards to mental health, that there's some research that indicates if an autistic individual understands their autism, essentially as a difference and not a disability, that is more associated with positive mental health. Therefore, that has implications for how we as adults understand and particularly talk about autism with our young people. So this is something that reading about and listening to podcasts or watching videos about specifically the neurodiversity movement, that can really support us with if it's something that doesn't feel like it comes too naturally to you. And it can particularly help around what language is appropriate to use and what language can be supportive to use. So another Dixit card that was chosen by a couple of the girls in my research was this one on the screen now. And the couple of quotes that they shared with it was, it's not a bad thing that I'm different. And the flower's still nice around the other flowers. All flowers are nice. Some are just different. So you can see how there's that narrative around difference and not disability in regards to their autism, which was found to be quite supportive for their mental health. So also as part of my research, I asked every girl that I met what they would want non-autistic people to know and understand about autism. So in order to share their voices and to share that message, I've included some of their quotes here too. So this top one, it's so different in different people. What people see of autism is not what everyone with autism is like. So this is about leaving those preconceptions at the door and those assumptions and stereotypes and exploring what autism means for that individual using a person-centered, needs-led approach. Okay. And the second quote is sort of relating to autism, emotional well-being, and it can be quite interesting. When someone tells you that they have autism, it's more like saying, I'm a perfectionist, than it is saying, I have depression. It's more of just a way of being than it is a thing on top of you. So it shouldn't be seen as a negative or a hindrance. It seems to be what this person is saying, but an aspect of what makes that person unique instead. What makes them, and that is part of their personality. And the final two quotes are focusing on that identity. As I say, that was a theme of my research anyway. But they said, autistic girls just want the same as everyone else. They just want what people that don't have autism want. I think the majority of them just don't know how to explain it or don't know how to go about it. And then finally, they're not like everyone, but they want to have the same goals and they want to achieve and do the things other people do too. So again, it's that idea of not seeing autistic girls, not treating them as different to others, and just being inclusive and supportive of them and their individuality as they present to you. And here are some further quotes from the other girls that I spoke to too. So again, pause the video if you want to read this in detail, but I'll just draw your attention to the final quote here, which says, just treat any girl, whether you suspect it or not, just like everyone else, because we are normal. We just have different wiring. I found that quote so powerful, and to hear that from that young person was really insightful. And I just think that's a brilliant message to hold, with all young people that we're working with. As she said, whether we suspect they're autistic or not, we should just treat them all the same. We'll move on now to thinking about the second section, I suppose, of this session about, when and how to support. What can schools actually do to support autistic females? Hopefully that first section has given you a bit of insight into their experiences, into the reasons that we need to think carefully about how to support them, and ways in which we can try and protect their mental health. But yeah, I'll drill down now into a bit more of the specifics and suggestions around the approaches to take, and then some specific kind of recommendations and resources that we can use as well when supporting them. So these are the conclusions drawn from my research specifically, but clearly align with a lot of the other research and recommendations that are out there. But first of all, what was really important for many of the girls that I spoke to was about school staff just noticing them and looking out for them. So even if on the face of it they seem to be managing, checking in with autistic girls in your setting. So one of the quotes from one of the girls that I spoke to was that in year 3, things changed for the better for her, that she was really struggling beforehand. But it changed because, and the quote here is, due to the fact that the teachers had actually noticed that I didn't have any friends now, and so they just assigned a student to being my friend. So her school used a buddy system to support her with that friendship making, and it was from having that buddy that she then sort of branched out and made further friends as well. Secondly, it's really important to rethink our assumptions about autism and about autistic females. So let's remember to use the language of internalized autism presentation instead of female autism presentation as much as we can, because this can help to describe more specifically what is meant by that stereotypical female presentation. But it's also important to sort of listen out for the assumptions that others are making about autistic females, and gently challenge them in those assumptions if we're able to, if we're comfortable to. It's important to also, in all of our support, focus on autistic individuals' sense of belonging and well-being, and that their empowerment in these scenarios and our environments. We know from the research that this is a huge protective factor in terms of positive mental health. So this can be partly addressed by instilling an inclusive and neurodiversity affirming environment in our settings. So one conclusion from my research was that it was important for participants to have the opportunity to explore their diagnosis and to consider what makes sense to them from it. But that needed to be done with the support of a trusted adult around them and helping them through that journey too. So it was also important, though, for the girls to realise that they weren't alone in their diagnosis or their experiences. So it can be helpful, for example, to support some connections or facilitate opportunities with other autistic students in your settings. Although with a caveat that it's important not to force it. Many individuals need more than just an autism diagnosis in common to feel a connection with someone else. Autism awareness work, of course, is also really important for all students, so that support in your school can be more proactive and preventative rather than just reactive. But I would say ensure that you consider how these awareness or intervention sessions would feel if you were autistic, whether that's diagnosed or not. So thinking about those key messages and how supportive the language and how things feel in those sessions. So making sure that you're framing it as a difference and not a disability. Let's model that acceptance and inclusion for our autistic learners. So now we'll take a look at what that might look like day to day in your settings for your learners. So as we've already mentioned, early intervention is best. Let's be preventative instead of reactive wherever possible. Secondly, being flexible with your learning and those activities that are on offer. Where possible, teach with the outcome in mind specifically. And if you have a reluctant learner, let's adjust things a bit differently so that outcome is still met. That might be doing things such as the discussion part of the task, doing it outside, or it might be using technology or changing the topic, although the outcome can still be achieved. And keeping in mind that actually many of those with internalised autism presentation don't like to get things wrong. So it's quite common to have sort of perfectionist tendencies, as this highly aligns with anxiety. And pre-teaching is important to support access to the learning. It supports that predictability, reduces anxieties around what might happen, what will come. Friendships are important to focus on too. So providing those opportunities for friendships using shared interests that might be through extracurricular activities that are on offer, but also thinking about how you can support them to form connections within lessons, using group working activities, or time to sort of share their strengths and interests. We need to acknowledge all of those beautiful talents that our young people have. Peer awareness, as I've already touched on a little bit, is really important. So the LEANS project is one that we would recommend. So that stands for Learning About Neurodiversity at School. So you can Google it. It's a free program available to schools that's got some sort of lesson plans that you can go through, and that supports peer awareness and peer support for neurodiverse learners. It's also important, of course, to ensure that your environment is low arousal and calming. So doing regular sort of sensory audits and trying to see it through their eyes. Let's also teach strategies to manage stress and anxiety and model those strategies as the adults around them. And as far as possible, make all of this part of your whole class work, not just for the individuals. Let's not other them and point them out specifically where these type of strategies can be helpful for so many more learners anyway. Ensuring effective home-school communication can be really important, and let's think about moving on just from communication to also co-producing, so being collaborative in that approach. And it's really important to build relationships and focus on how we build relationships with our autistic learners. This might just be through the little things, how you say hello. Maybe it's a special handshake or greeting that you have. Maybe it's chatting to them whilst you're sorting the classroom, asking them for their help if they enjoy being helpful and part of things. Have lunch with them from time to time, that sort of thing. I guess it's using the PACE approach, if that's something you're familiar with as well, the playfulness, acceptance, curiosity and empathy, PACE, in our interactions to develop that sort of genuine reciprocal relationship. So as part of that relationship building, check-ins, check-ups and check-outs throughout the day helps them to feel more supported and connected. And also just as staff, trying to remain attuned to our learners, which can be exhausting, but can be really important, particularly for those who can't outwardly express their anxiety or their needs as easily. So it's about being that stress detector for them. Let's notice the small and the subtle signs of their anxiety that's heightening and intervene where we can, so that they don't have to keep putting that mask on all day. Further strategies and approaches to think about are the does it really matter approach, or that DERM approach. And that's just thinking about, does this behaviour really matter? Does it matter that they perhaps don't have their shoes on if they're in the classroom, but they're sat down doing their learning? So picking your battles almost. And also consider the appropriate reasonable adjustments that you can put in place. So some of the examples are sort of described in these bullet points for social interaction, supporting their communication, supporting their information processing, sensory needs, and also the homework. So just thinking about how we can make these little things a bit more manageable and a bit more adjusted for these learners. Teaching relaxation strategies to all students is beneficial, but especially for those with higher anxiety, as we know is often the case with autistic females. And if there are any behaviours that need sort of further unpicking or further understanding, using things like star charts, which are similar to ABCs, not like a star sticker chart, but STAR stands for the setting, the trigger, the action and the result. It's just a way of breaking down a scenario to try and reflect on what happened in that scenario and if that was the best way to handle that situation, or if it were to happen again, could or should it be handled a bit differently. But of course, you're not alone in managing this. So if the previous recommendations that I've just gone through aren't enough for your young learners, there are other places that you can go to seek further support. So The Autism Education Trust is one to consider. So there's training and online free resources that you can look at. The Specialist Teaching Service also provides some of this training for free to schools. So be sure to check that out. Speak with your specialist teacher if that's something that you want to explore. There's our CAS service across Coventry and Warwickshire, so the Community Autism Support Service. They offer workshops for parents and professionals, and there's the opportunities to refer for sort of one-to-one, small group or even youth group support for autistic individuals. That's not specific to females. And also just to note, due to the success and the demand of CAS over the past year or two, they've been given additional funding this year even to be able to hopefully reach even more young people and to be more available for them. We also have our RISE service, so this is for referrals to the neurodevelopmental team, or if there are children struggling with their mental health particularly, you can complete that Dimensions tool, get information and some suggestions from there, or go on for that for further referral. Autism Central is also a website that has information for parents and carers, so that's somewhere that you can signpost them to. And then of course there are services within the local authority as well for that sort of more one-to-one bespoke support, so such as the Specialist Teaching Service and the Educational Psychology Service. So we can be contacted for further support for that individual and for some of that problem solving and recommendations for hopefully moving things forward for them. It might also be helpful to refer to, and it's helpful to be aware of at least, the Warwickshire Neurodivergent Graduated Approach, which has been developed and written in recent years, but there's more information there about the local services and the support that is available around for our autistic individuals. I just want to take you through this brief reminder, of course, that all support comes within that graduated response, that assess, plan, do, review cycle that we need for evidencing all the support we put in place and for ensuring that the right level of support is in place for your learners. So it's important to consider, in-school support before then involving those external agencies. But external services such as the EPS might be able to support with that problem solving or the training. Perhaps it's gathering the young person's views to understand things more from their perspective, or advocating for the young person to then hopefully move things forwards. So at this point, I just wanted to highlight, I suppose, some of my favourite resources and books that I frequently recommend or use. So there are so many out there, of course, and so many great ones out there, that many that I won't have come across yet. But these are just some of them that I use personally. So in the top left, we've got the My Amazing Autistic Brain cards, which are really great for having a sort of balanced discussion or activities with a young person about their strengths and their challenges in relation to their autism and otherwise. It helps to build a picture of them as an individual, as some of the cards say, I struggle with, and it has some suggestions, and the others are, I am good at. So it's just a way of building their individuality and their personality, but visually too. In the bottom right, we've got I Am Special, which is also a workbook to be completed with an individual that explores their personal experiences of being autistic and sort of understanding themselves a bit more, so kind of aligned with those amazing autistic brain cards. Then moving on to in the middle, the ASD Girls Wellbeing Toolkit. So that's an intervention program really, and it's been developed by educational psychologists, but as an intervention that focuses on areas such as me and my mental health, relationships and communication skills, and helping them to build a toolkit really for their well-being and their future health too. So there's sort of set programs or session plans to work through with a small group or individually with girls. There are books also to be recommended to the girls themselves who are autistic to read through and just to hear more about others' experiences of autism. and to perhaps learn more about themselves and reflect on themselves a bit more too. So sort of perhaps for the younger ages, we've got in the bottom left the Can You See Me and the Geek Girl. They're both a book in series, a couple of series there. They're fiction books, but they are written by autistic authors and based largely on their personal experiences. So it can be quite fun to read, but also quite insightful for them. Or perhaps for those maybe older girls or those who prefer more of a non-fiction type read, we've got the Camouflage there in the top right, or The Hidden Lives of Autistic Women. And that's actually a graphic novel with real life case studies that describes their lived experiences too. So you can see how reading around, and there's many, many more books out there, but reading around the topic could help them just reflect a bit more and explore that a bit more themselves, even if it doesn't directly describe them in themselves. And then finally on this slide, the yellow book that's at the bottom is a book written by Dr. Luke Bearden called Autism and Asperger's Syndrome in Children. And that's a read for parents or professionals working with children, but for those who want to understand more about autism. And in the way that it's written, it acknowledges both the challenges their child might face as well as the strengths that comes with that diagnosis too. As I say, there are many more resources out there and new ones that are being created all of the time, but these are my favourites that I either use or recommend at the moment too. And I'll say at this point too, that if anyone is interested in knowing more about my research that I've referred to throughout today, and with the quotes and the Dixit cards, the research summary will also be shared with all those who receive this spotlight by email. And you're always welcome to contact me for a copy of the full, longer dissertation if that's of interest too. So here are just some further signposts for the websites that you can take a look at and explore in your own time that might help to develop your understanding of autistic girls even further, or to find some of those resources and information out there to share with others. And here's a further signposting slide, but these are those key organisations that we signpost to each time in one of these mental health spotlights for all young people and learners. So these aren't autism specific, but these are things that we know with more information and more support for those with mental health difficulties. So all that's left is for me to say thank you so much for joining me today, and for joining Eve and Dan on the day of this input too, if you were there. I hope you found it helpful and that there's been some ideas shared and some sound bites to sort of take away and reflect on for yourselves too. If you need any further information, please contact the Educational Psychology Service using the details that are on the screen now. Okay, thanks again.